Computer. There we go. So, Tuesday, March 1st, 2022, first day of International Women's Month, International Women's History Month. Next Tuesday is obviously International Women's Day, the 8th of March. More about that later. So, because of the interest in that I've got for books about rock and roll that are written by women, I inadvertently ended up choosing two books which oddly enough really complement each other in a lot of different ways because of the question, and this has, been the question for women's studies, people, since time immemorial, or since, people started looking at women's studies, is who gets to tell the stories that are out there and why? How do they earn the right to be considered storytellers? What stories do they get to tell? What degree of personal history do they get to weave into the stories that they tell? And for our two books that we're going to be looking at in March of this year, that is this month and then on the 15th, I've chosen books by journalists. I've chosen books by two journalists who have very different trajectories to their careers. Tonight's book by Lisa Robinson is written by a woman who was one of the first women to write for Cream magazine. On the other hand, Sylvia Patterson, whose book we'll be looking at in 2 weeks' time, is somebody who wrote for the UK music press and really lived the whole experience of what it's like to go through not just the technological change that underpinned music or has underpinned music for the last 20, 25 years, but also how we perceive celebrity. More about this book in 2 weeks' time. So if you are looking for a really interesting book, this one's fascinating. This is another one I know I'm going to blow through in a couple of days. But first, let's get to tonight's author, who is, in addition to being one of the most historic and long, music journalists with whose career's longevity is just amazing. Lisa Robinson's been writing since the early 1970s, so that means that she is one of the writers who got to write about people like the Stones. She got to fly on this jet with the Stones. She toured with Led Zeppelin. She was there for the biggest era of rock and roll, excess, pruning back, coming back. And in all that time, one of the things that she noticed was that people were extremely interested in her books about, or her stories about, what was it like to be in Keith Richards, hotel room when he's coming out of a heroin daze and things like that. But the title of the book said, nobody really ever asked her about the women who she'd interviewed, or nobody even asked her, showed much interest in it. And instead of actually trying to paraphrase it badly as I usually do, I'm going to commit a bit of copyright theft and I'm actually going to read it out loud. In the more than 1,000 interviews I've done with women, I've heard all their stories. Their luck was different. The effects of success or failure on their lives was different. But the goals and struggles were often similar. To be heard, to be seen, to be loved, to be famous. To be rich was probably part of it, but nobody really owns up to it. Not at first, if ever. These women had obsessions that were often limitless, hopes that were unrealistic, and ambitions that might have been unachievable. Like all women, life has not been easy for the women in music. So already we've got the glove dropped. We are looking at a book that covers the career of women in a lot of different genres of music. We've got Joni Mitchell, we've got Patti Smith, we've got Beyonce, we've got Lady Gaga. There's a really great part of the book here where she talks about going for drinks and talking about men, in a Manhattan dive bar with Lady Gaga. And Madam Gaga, if you're ever watching, I will gladly invite you to have drinks in a Manhattan dive bar at some point in time. The drinks are on me. I would just love to have a conversation like that with you at some point in time. So why doesn't anybody ever really ask about the girls? Now, this is an interesting part because we do see that sexism plays a huge role in it. We see that, the editors of the publications for whom Lisa Robinson was writing at the time really weren't necessarily that interested unless the women came part and parcel within the scenes of the music that, happened to be searching forth at the time. So when she writes about, for example, the Ramones playing at CBGB's, she talks about Patti Smith, but, for all the amazing stories and, life that Patti Smith has had, the interest in the Ramones was always so much greater than the interest that people had in Patti Smith. And I'm actually hoping to get Karen Rose in, because Karen's just published a new book about why Patti Smith matters. So fingers crossed that we'll be able to get Karen on the show probably sometime in the fall, hopefully when the book's out for distribution. So going back to that topic, why doesn't anybody ask about the girls? The sexism, and this comes back to what I was talking about originally with the idea of who gets to tell stories and who doesn't. The press, when you think back to the press of that time, would have been, big magazines like Rolling Stone and Cream, and in the UK you would have had the New Musical Express, you would have had the Melody Maker, Smash Hits, and obviously these are businesses. These are not NGOs, they're not charitable organizations. These are publications which are run by companies that want to make money. And in a lot of cases, the money is made by publishing stories about highly dysfunctional behavior. The story about Jimmy Page running off with a 13-year-old girl, or, sex, drugs, rock and roll, that sort of like triumvirate of things that, drove music for such a long time. And because I think that one of the ideas in the book is that because women couldn't get away with a lot of that stuff really easily, with the exception of maybe people like Janis Joplin, women weren't allowed to live those lives of excess that men often had, which didn't mean that they didn't do it. They just couldn't base their careers on being that dysfunctional in the way that a lot of rock stars in the 60s, 70s, and 80s often did. Women had to be much more astute about their business dealings. Women had to be a lot more careful about the image they projected and the kinds of impressions that people got of them as artists. And women had to fight a lot to be heard as equal partners in the industry, and I think they still do. As for all the faults that the streaming economy and the online economy has, that may actually prove to be one of the great levelers for women artists, is that, we can carve out niches of our own, carve out spaces of our own, basically be our own record companies in a way that would have been unthinkable 30 or 40 years ago, unless you were someone like Annie DeFranco, who just decided to pick up and, start her own record company. The truth is that I liked the book. I enjoyed the book. I enjoyed the thesis of the book, but I really do wish that there had been a little bit more excavation into that. Why doesn't anybody care about women? Or why is the attention that is paid to women artists not necessarily the same as what you might see? Sorry, it's very dry in here today. The same that you might see for male artists. And just even thinking about that last Pogo poster that I've got behind me, which is a documentary about punk rock in the late 1970s in Toronto, you can read that entire list and only find 3 bands with women in them. With all the other bands that are listed in there, the only bands really that had women were the B-Girls, Martha and the Muffins, and of course I'm just blanking on the third one now. I want to say the Battered Wives, but I don't think that's it. Because it just, we had to fight to have our own place. We still have to fight to have our own place. And if that intention isn't paid within the ecosystem, then it doesn't come out on the end when the publicity machine starts working. And that's the part I think I would have enjoyed seeing in this book, was finding out more from the back end of things, from the editors, from the publishers. Why didn't you want to publish more stories about women in rock and roll? Why is it that when we look at the 1980s, like there are very few women, who were able to make careers in the 1980s without selling themselves as sex symbols? I mean, having been in the 1980s, I can remember that really, the only people who ever wore only women who ever really wore a lot of clothes in music were like the Parachute Club and Luba. That was it, It was just accepted that if you weren't tall, skinny, and really good looking, and probably somebody wanted to have sex with you, odds are you weren't going to get a music career out of it. Which is, okay, yes, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I understand the sex appeal part of it. is fine, but when you're starting to gatekeep the talent and gatekeep the stories in the music solely on the basis of whether you think you want to sleep with that person or not, there's a real chance that you're going to lose one hell of a lot of talent in the process. And that's the one story that I think I would have really enjoyed reading about in this book, is not just the perspective of the artists themselves, but also the other women who were behind the scenes, the publishers, the women who were working in the music press, the women who were working for the record companies, the photographers, you know, the movers and the shakers, because they had to have been out there. They were out there. Dee Lippenwell, for example, was a very famous Canadian photographer who took amazing shots of bands in the 1970s and 1980s, but she's not as well known as a lot of her contemporaries, like Dennis Callahan. Anyway, would I recommend the book? I would recommend the book with a very big asterisk beside it. And that asterisk is, this is just the work of one journalist going into her archives, literally Lisa Robinson going into her collection of DATs and her tapes and going, oh, there's an interview with Joni, there's another interview with Joni, there's another interview with Joni, putting them all together and then compiling the stories based on certain themes about money, about sex, about marriage, things like that. It's an excavation. And it's a very fascinating excavation. Don't get me wrong. That is one of the biggest appeals of this. But it is just one facet of the picture. And there's a whole other picture out there that could be seen and could be examined. But this isn't the book for that, unfortunately. But there is room for it. So if anybody is interested in writing a book about women in the music industry as a whole, you know, how women were the movers and shakers, I guarantee you, you've got a guaranteed audience for that, because people are going to look at this and go, okay, so this is part of the story. What else comes after? What else went on behind? So, again, nobody ever asked me about The Girls by Lisa Robinson, music editor of Vanity Fair magazine, published by Henry Holt in 2001, so late last year. I'd give it a 7 out of 10. You know, definitely one for people who love rock and roll, or if you are a huge fan of any of the artists who are portrayed in the book, or you want to find out more about the sociology of what this is like as a line of work. This is definitely an interesting read. I'm definitely keeping this one. Nobody can borrow this one, because I really like this one a lot. But yeah, I just wish it had just that slight bit more, just that slight little bit more of dirt and behind the scenes kind of stuff, which I think we're going to get with Sylvia Patterson's. Sorry. This thing goes out of focus every time I move my head. So I apologize in advance if it's like getting weird on you guys. That's a story I think we're going to get on March 15th with Sylvia Patterson's I'm Not With the Band. Sylvia was a journalist with the Smash Hits. Yes, I get them all mixed up. Smash Hits magazine. And there's a very fascinating anecdote about her interviewing Lily Allen in 2006 and 2014, and just how the whole online ecosystem of music streaming, of Twitter, of social media, of trolls has completely soured and washed out the experience of what it means not just to be an artist, but also to be a journalist as well. So again, that's I'm Not With the Band, a writer's life in music by Sylvia Patterson, published by Sphere Books out of the UK. Again, if you don't feel like ordering it, or you don't think you can get it from your bookseller, your local independent bookseller, not guys who send themselves to space, always consider your local interlibrary loan, especially if you're in Ontario, because odds are somebody in Ontario, some library in Ontario probably does have this book in its shelves. So again, March 15th, I'm Not With the Band, Sylvia Patterson. Definitely check it out. It's engaging. It's funny. Like Liz Phair, she doesn't spare herself. She realizes that she's part of this ecosystem, and she doesn't give herself a break in a lot of ways, for good and for bad, and she recognizes that as well. So, just before we wrap up, to let you know about the books that are coming up, we're going to have, I can never remember the proper order of the words, Close, 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 Music, 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 Boys, Boys, Boys by Viv Albertine. on April 19th. So that's if you're looking for reading a month and a half ahead. If you're looking just for the beginning of April, then it's going to be Crying in H Mart by Japanese Breakfast's Michelle Zonder. And a final word before we go. Tonight's the first night of the open mic over at Live on Elgin, above Zach's on Elgin Street, just below Nepean. I am going to be the featured artist at next week's Live on Elgin open mic. I'll be there doing 5 songs along with Jumpin' Joel Elliott, the host and bon raconteur of the open mic night. So I hope to see you there. Admission is free. If you play, come early, sign up, put your name in the lottery system. It is one of the most friendly, laid-back open mics that the city has, and it's a real pleasure to play. Until next time, keep reading, keep rocking, and we'll talk to you on March 15th. Take care now. Bye-bye.